DigitalFUTURES on behalf of Ron and myself for recognizing this project, the pink teeter totters at the border between the United States and Mexico. You know, we started working on projects at the border around 2001, and we saw the early wall construction being built as a result of the 2006 Secure Fence Act. And we saw immediately the kind of absurdity and the cruelty of this wall. And in 2009, we started making these proposals for projects at the border that would actually bring people together, that would use the border as a vehicle for not dividing, but promoting togetherness, right? And it took us 10 years, literally 10 years from conception to completion to realize this project at full scale. And on May 28, 2019, we were able to show the world that play can be an act of both joy and resistance. And we've continued to work at the expanded border between the United States and Mexico, not only the current political border, but also the historical border as well. And our work there examines relationships between the past and the future. You know, we often look back to look forward. We look at traditional and indigenous materials like mud and clay and rethink how they can be used in the future through technologies such as robotics and 3D printing. And it has been an important goal of ours to think about how design and technology can be used as vehicles to bring people together, right? To be inclusive and to create new paradigms for the future and how we live and work together. So I thank you again. I'm going to hand it off to Ron because I have this slow Wi-Fi connection, but he's going to share some examples of recent work from us. Okay.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil, so much. We are exceptionally honored to receive this award. And as Virginia mentioned, I'm going to share some of the work that we've been working on. And let me just begin the slideshow here. As you mentioned, we're part of two practices, and Emerging Objects, which deals exclusively with 3D printing, and RAEL San Fratello, which works more on social projects in the borderlands. And we've been thinking about how the borderlands are a site of hybridity, where people of different languages and cultures and belief systems come together, and new kinds of ideas are born from that. And we, in fact, spent all of COVID over a year in a very special place that crosses the border between southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, called the San Luis Valley. It's a high alpine desert that's bordered by 14 and 13,000 foot mountains. But what's very special about this place is that it is the northernmost frontier of the former territory of what was Mexico before the Mexican-American War. And so we think very much about this idea of the expanded borderlands, a borderlands that is not only geopolitical, but also the borders that move into realms of technology, or those thresholds between the past and the future, as Virginia said, or between materials or between ideas. In this landscape, it is a landscape where the legacy of those historic borderlands still exists. Earthen structures that were the remains of the previous peoples who have been colonized several times, my own ancestors. And we're actively working on restoring about 8 of these buildings in this landscape, including our own house, which we use as a teaching tool, an instrument for teaching people about traditional methods of building, using mud, traditional indigenous practices of mud plastering houses, and also traditional ways of cooking as well. And we've embarked on a project that looks at traditional indigenous cooking and food ways, and working with communities to explore those ideas in the expanded borderlands. And I'm going to show you a very short clip of a project that we've embarked on where we are building these traditional mud ovens in immigrant shelters along the US-Mexico border as a way of bringing community together.
¿Qué construimos? Me encanta. Aquí reconstruimos personas y reconstruimos la humanidad.
Como te digo, soy guatemalteco, ya no soy ningún muchacho jovencito. Acostumbramos a hacer el pan según la costumbre de nuestro pueblo. Tú me dices si se está viendo para poner más madera, porque ya estamos close.
So this project of building traditional mud ovens along the border comes from an understanding of the ways of making in this landscape, but ways of bringing communities together. And so in immigrant shelters where people have been stuck along the border, especially during the previous regime in the United States, in immigrant shelters from countries around the world, we have used this ancient cooking technology as a way to bring the communities who are coming to these shelters together. And these are communities that are not only coming from Latin America, but from around the world, from Russia, from Haiti, from India, and bringing them together to literally make and break bread to become a community again before they move onward with their journey. And we've begun to construct a number of these mud hornos as kinds of objects of resistance, objects to bring people together, but also resist the idea that these walls exist between communities and we can come together around things that are very common to us, which is earth and food and fire. What's very beautiful about that clip that I just showed you is they're interviewing the woman who's a nun who runs that shelter in a documentary film that's now at the Venice Biennale in the Italian pavilion that you can see. But she's asked by the documentary filmmaker, "What are you making here?" And of course, in the background, we're building this mud oven. But she doesn't reply, "We're building a mud oven." What she says, in fact, what we're doing here in the shelter is we're rebuilding humanity. We're rebuilding people emotionally and physically and psychologically as they've come to this point on an incredible journey and a journey full of hardship, and they're about to embark on another journey. So this idea of using mud is essential to our practice. And during the previous regime, we began to build upon a technology that we innovated about 6 years ago of 3D printed clay, 3D printed ceramics, which now has taken, so many people are doing it. But then we were embodying it with political ideas and ideas of geography. And the leader of the previous regime had mentioned that there were in fact bad hombres at the US-Mexico border. And our experience was something very different, that there are not bad hombres. But what was interesting to us as well was that the regime leader didn't say there were bad hombres at the border, which means they're bad men. He said, in fact, they're bad hombres at the border. And I'm like, well, that's interesting that he actually recognizes this beautiful gradient between light and dark that we understand in the art world, and to think about how that gradient is a gradient of culture. So we embarked upon this idea of the bad hombres. We discovered that in the hairstyle world, that maybe what's on the left is a bad hombre, when the right's a good hombre, I guess. I don't know, but we began to think about how material itself could express ideas. We used clay from the then Republican state of Georgia, and clay from the Democratic state of California to think about how we might weave together materials to have an expression of an object that in its totality expressed these different ideas and different materials at different scales, in the scale of the object, but also in the scale of the detail as well. So the darker and lighter hues are these hombres that are expressing ideas that we expressed through the technology of 3D printed ceramics, introducing this technology of additive manufacturing into a tradition of ceramics that have been around for 10,000 years. We thought, wouldn't it be more interesting if we were able to take soil from Mexico and soil from the United States to do that? And we begin to experiment with ways of using local clays along the US-Mexico border in El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Mexico, involving 25 ceramic artists and professors from the University of Texas, El Paso, to create a project that looked at the frontiers of mud in different ways. We worked with the students, the ceramicists, the professors to explore clay sites of traditional clay harvesting along the border in both countries. And we harvested them, and we discovered this amazing complexion of clays, from whites to browns, even greens you might see. And we developed this software which we now call Potterware, which is available now if you go to potterware.com, but a very accessible software for especially ceramic artists who may not know how to use a 3D modeling program or may not know how to use a 3D printer, but are interested in that technology. And this made it very accessible for ceramic artists to then very quickly make these kinds of forms that we're making. So we have made this available to the world. It's now being used in universities and colleges and high schools all over the planet. And it's just a simple way of making 3D printed functional pottery out of the ground that's just outside wherever anyone is on the planet, using very simple techniques. And we thought that the 25 ceramic artists would make 25 pots, but they ended up making around 270 of these beautiful objects during this project. This idea of taking the clay from the ground and printing was part of a larger endeavor that we've embarked on for the last 10 years, is how can we make buildings this way? I showed you some of the adobe mud structures that exist in this landscape, but could we use 3D printing to do that? Well, some of our first experiments embarked on taking ceramic printed objects to make cladding for tiles of buildings. And in this project called the Cabin of 3D Printed Curiosities, we built, or we used the opportunity that was made available to the residents living in the San Francisco Bay Area because of a housing emergency, where they relaxed the building code. So you could build up to 1,200 square feet on a piece of property without the consultation of an architect or going before the planning board, to see if our innovations in 3D printing could be used to make a small accessory dwelling unit. And so we 3D printed about 4,000 of these ceramic cladding units that were attached to a 3D printed substrate using this technique we developed 6 years ago, which allowed each ceramic component to be different, even though digitally it was exactly the same. So the very different wiggle allowed for each of these tiles to be almost perfect, but not quite, as if they were a handmade ceramic object. The front facade of this building employs many of our innovations in 3D printed materials, using 3D printed wood and cellulose, 3D printed cement, 3D printed Chardonnay grape skins that were harvested from the waste products of wine production in Northern California. Each of these tiles holds succulents that grow very well in the Northern California climate, making and situating this house sort of, in a way, very much responsive to the climate and to the material ecology of place. The interior of the cabin is bioplastic, which is very common, of course, but exploring ways that that could be used in cladding and its translucency and its materiality and where that material comes from. And so it's backlit to the cabin itself as its own lantern that can set the mood of the cabin during different parts of the day or night or evening. Each tile is actually different and attached to the wall. So it builds upon past traditions like pressed tin panel, but instead of having one mold making the same panel over and over again, we are making every panel different because of the capabilities of additive manufacturing. We're also experimenting on how we make furniture, for example, the chairs, the tables, the lighting fixtures, using several of our techniques and material innovations. And you can see how the cabin transforms throughout the day, and the evening set it up for a place to sleep at night. So these ideas of using additive manufacturing in the borderlands and hybridizing technologies and materials and techniques allowed us to begin to get closer to a fundamental idea: is how do we print much larger structures out of materials that are available on hand? Because this was in fact our very early goal. We weren't interested in just playing with pottery only, but these were study models for much larger structures. And in this idea of returning to the borderlands, we realized that we had to develop not only materials, but also hardware and software to enable ourselves to make accessible, inexpensive strategies for printing at large scale. So we developed this schematic for this very portable robot about 5 years ago. And given our limited resources, we partnered with a manufacturing company that was manufacturing ceramic printers at that time to think about how we can scale up. And so we partnered together to make a very accessible robot that uses SCARA technologies that could print larger structures. And once we finalized that, we took it back out to the borderlands for the first time in history to begin to 3D print the material that people have been using in that landscape for thousands of years, not only to make large-scale proto-architectural structures, but functional pottery, both using the material at hand that you can find within feet, within just a short distance of the construction site itself. We call this project Mud Frontiers because we see mud as something that's mobile. We can take this printer anywhere and drop it down in the landscape. It's ubiquitous, the material is ubiquitous, and we are democratizing it. We're making it accessible and available to anyone. And so we conceptualize these projects around 3 ideas. One, about lightness. Typically, earthen structures are very heavy, but in fact, because we can corrugate and undulate the material, we can print very thin shell structures out of mud at large scales. And we're also thinking about how we might illuminate these in these landscapes at night, in these desert remote landscapes. The second is the beacon or the lookout, and how we can think about how we begin to 3D print program, such as stairs, for example. And basically, we're just scaling up the idea of how we might print using this material. The kiln, where we harvested local micaceous clays to 3D print pottery, learning from our friends just across the Colorado-New Mexico border, to make functional pottery that's low fire, made out of micaceous clays that are harvested from traditional sites, and ways to think about structure and build upon these very thin walls, holding 2 shells together with rot-resistant juniper that's harvested from the forest just in the hills beyond, and think about how we might be able to introduce program into this, make a hearth and fire place for people to gather, the 3D printing of furniture, and places where people can come together. I'll take you for a quick walk in our COVID era laboratory, which is just a remote site in the borderlands, where we're 3D printing these objects, and the table is the landscape itself, and we're leaving them there and analyzing them at full scale. Many of these structures are experiments in creating domes and enclosures, thinking about how tall we can go, ways of creating openings and fenestration, the phenomena of light and texture and material in this landscape, but also experiments in ways that we can implement low-cost innovations to build faster and taller and stronger. And so what you see here is a third rail, which in the typical robotics world is quite expensive for, so let's say, a KUKA robot to travel along a track. Instead, we made ours out of wood, and we're moving the robot because it's so portable, so we can make a multicellular structure that can print very quickly, extruding the soil from the surrounding landscapes in ways that have been done for thousands of years, but embarking on and hybridizing a new technology in the borderlands. And using an innovation that is quite inexpensive and operated just with our cell phone. Showing what it looks like in our laboratory site. All these experiments led to something that we call CASA COVIDA. COVIDA in Spanish is a word that means something like cohabitation, but also looks like the word COVID, because it's a project that we built during the time of COVID to bring people together for cohabitation. It's sort of a prototype house for 2 people. In this remote landscape, we're experimenting with materials and how one could build very cheaply. We built this at a cost of $16 in materials. We partnered with friends and textile artists from the region to make the textiles and bedding for the 3 programs within the house. 1 is a place to sleep. 2 is a place to cook using the functional pottery and gather around warmth and fire. And the 3rd space is a place for bathing, harvesting the local waters that are warmed in a place where you can look at the skies and stars above. People often ask us, are you going to put a roof? And we quite enjoyed looking at the stars and the skies, but we had this idea for a hybrid roof that again mixes traditional technologies with contemporary innovations like pneumatics and this pneumatic roof that imparted colors into the space itself, kind of the cherry on top of this chocolate sundae of a house. The ideas in the borderlands, as you've seen, expand to the material, the geopolitical, the geological, but also notions of how we can smuggle activism into design. And during the time that we were building these projects out in these remote environments, we were constantly bombarded with news of child separation at the US-Mexico border. And while we were in this remote environment and not able to participate in protest, we wanted to make a sign so that our friends in the cities could use during the protest, during the child separation. And we wanted to build upon the genius of this particular sign, which is quite iconic in the borderlands. This sign was created by a graphic designer who's a Native American from New Mexico named John Hood, who worked for the California Department of Transportation and was assigned to create a design for a sign that would warn motorists that people would be dropped off alongside the highway by human traffickers and might attempt to run across the highway so that motorists wouldn't hit them. And he smuggled in some beautiful aspects of design activism into this sign because he related the plight of the immigrant today as that of the Navajo during the long walk when they were displaced from their own homelands. What's extremely interesting about this sign is the way that he thought very carefully about, for example, using a young girl with pigtails. He thought that's who drivers might empathize with the most. And he used the silhouette of the civil rights leader, Cesar Chavez, as the head of the father in the sign. And so we wanted to build upon the genius of this sign. And we made one simple move, which was to turn the families to each other, to face each other, and use the word reunite. And we made this an open source sign that people could download, and it began to be downloaded and people began to use it in protest. But it also caught the attention of the largest public art campaign in the world called the For Freedoms Foundation. And we were able to bring this sign back to the highway in a way that we couldn't have imagined prior, which was in the form of an enormous digital billboard alongside the highway where hundreds of thousands of people could see. And so this idea of smuggling activism into design and hybridizing the condition, blurring the line between what is design, what is activism, and where the context in which this is displayed began to be something that we were very interested in. You can now see this sign at the walls of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. And people continue to download this sign. And for example, this artist is placing them throughout Los Angeles using the same company that makes the speed limit signs in Los Angeles and installing them to those signs. But smuggling them to other contexts as well, to think about how the use of art and design can become a form of activism in the context such of museums, for example, and how the facade of the Johnson Museum at Cornell was suddenly also a form of activism to communicate a message about how we might think about designing a United States and not a divided states, for example. So this idea of smuggling design into other contexts and smuggling activism into the context of design is something that is very interesting to us. And thinking about this hybrid idea of the borderlands and what an important laboratory is that is to explore these ideas. In that book, Border Walls Architecture, Virginia and I made a number of illustrations that told the story of the 800 miles of wall that were being constructed along the US-Mexico border at a cost of about $4 million per mile on average, sometimes up to $23 million a mile. And many of those illustrations, as Neil pointed out, border between political satire or political cartoons, the very seriousness of the issues that are present. They tell stories of, let's say, a biography of the border wall between the United States. But one of those illustrations that we made back in 2009 was an illustration that told the story of the border being a metaphorical fulcrum between labor relationships and trade relationships, those balances that are created between trade balances of two allied countries that are neighbors, but also the inequities that exist between wealth and poverty on both sides. And so these illustrations came in the form of drawings and architectural models that we called recuerdos, or souvenirs, that remember the time that we built the border wall and what a ridiculous idea that was. But this particular illustration, called Teeter Totter Wall, was one that could potentially go beyond an illustration of the absurdity of the borderlands, but to be a project that could actually use the same material that the wall is made out of, but in fact, instead of divide communities, bring people together. And so we began the process of thinking about how this teeter-totter could exist in the world. And we began to calibrate it to the sites of the borderlands, how we might smuggle in the teeter-totter itself, insert it through the walls, those dimensions, how we might add the seats, and how it might be a collaborative effort on both sides to bring people together. And we worked with a metal fabrication shop in Juarez, Mexico. This is one of the very first rides of the teeter-totter, just seeing it as an object. And we had to think about its siting, how we would move from a metaphorical fulcrum to a literal fulcrum along the US-Mexico border, and how it would attach and how it would insert itself, how long Border Patrol would take to arrive once they saw us carrying a large object to the wall from the US side to the Mexico side. And we calibrated it such that we realized we had about 8 minutes to potentially have an event with families and children along the US-Mexico border. We collaborated with an art organization in Juarez called Colectivo Chopeque to build these structures and work with communities. And every aspect of this is a collaborative design, thinking very carefully about not only how it's sited, but what does it mean to build play as an act of resistance in a landscape of violence. And so while pink is a very fun color, and it stands apart from the wall, and it is a moment of joy, it also allows us to remember that that color pink in Juarez is used to remember the women who were killed during the time of violence in the city of Juarez, and has a very particular meaning on that front. And so with the continued news of child separation, the continued news of more construction of walls along the US-Mexico border to keep people apart and to actually cause damage to ecologies and environments and people, we decided that we would simply have the event one day. We didn't ask permission. We simply asked the communities if they would like to participate. They happily agreed, and this is how that day went. It was not moments before we slipped the teeter-totter into the wall that the children were climbing on them, that people were laughing, people were together. Border Patrol did show up within 10 minutes as we predicted. They asked what we were doing. We said we were having an event with the families and children, and they stood their ground at a distance, parked away, and allowed the event to continue. The Mexican National Guard arrived later, asked what was going on. We said we were having an event with children, and they too stood their ground. And so what was created that day was a sanctuary of space defined by women and children and grandmothers and aunts and the communities at the border, recognizing that the borderlands are public space, that this is a public project funded by public money, and we can in fact decide what happens in the borderlands. And if we don't want a wall, maybe we can decide that we don't want a wall, and that wall can come down someday. But for this very moment, we wanted to demonstrate a very different narrative of the borderlands, that it's not a place where no one lives and where bad men are doing bad things, but in fact, it's a place where women and children live every day and do the things that people do all over the world with their children. They play, they take pictures on their cell phones, they post them to social media, and they experience joy despite the oppression of the wall that exists there today. And so, as Virginia said, for about 40 minutes, and no one stopped us. The reason that we stopped doing this is because, just like on any playground, the children were simply tired of playing and wanted to move on to something else. And so for those 40 minutes, this very small event was able to show the world that the actions that take place on one side have a direct consequence on the other. So I thank you for your attention. I thank you very much for this award, and we're very honored. Thank you very much.